Cold does not feel like cold once it has decided to kill you. It feels like a hand the size of the sky pressing the breath flat out of your chest, and then, worse, it feels like warmth, like somebody has finally come and laid a heavy quilt over you out there in the dark, and the lie of that warmth is the last thing most people ever believe. She was on her knees in a drift that had already swallowed her to the waist. A few months' worth of somebody else's baby held hard against her, with arms she could no longer feel. The snow coming sideways so thick the camp lamps behind her had gone to a smear, and then to nothing. And a man's voice was still ringing in her ears from the warm doorway he had thrown her out of, saying, almost kindly, "Let the mountains settle it." Then she was 22 years old, and she had stopped being able to tell up from down. And then, out of the white roar where there should have been nothing but more dying, a shape came that was darker and bigger than the storm, smelling even there of wet hide and pine pitch and cold iron. And a voice scraped low under the wind. Not a question. "You're not done yet." Rewind. 6 weeks before a man put her out a door to freeze, the woman who would owe a stranger her whole life and hate herself for needing to was bent over a steaming washtub behind a saloon in a silver camp called Quartz Hollow, scrubbing another woman's blood out of another woman's dress and not yet knowing it was blood. Her name was Adeline Vance, Addie to the 2 or 3 people who had ever said it gently, and she was the company laundress, the camp's lowest paid and least seen soul, a girl who took in the washing of 40 filthy men and a dozen dance hall women for $1 a week and her bunk in a lean-to off the wash house, and who had learned to be invisible the way a rabbit learns to be still. She had come up into the Bitterroot Range 2 years gone with no husband and no people, her mother lost to a flooded river when Addie was 9, and her father to whiskey in the road not long after, and a girl alone with no money goes where the work is, and the work that hungry winter had been a brand new strike men spoke of as if it were paved with silver. It was not paved with silver. It was less a town than a sore the diggers had rubbed raw into the side of the mountain and would not let scab over. One rutted street of frozen mud and crushed quartz. False front buildings leaning shoulder to shoulder against the wind. A company store that took back in goods every dollar it paid out in wages. And at the head of the street, lamplit and loud and never quite closing, the Galena. A saloon and dance hall, and behind it, in a row of plank cribs no bigger than horse stalls, the place where the camp kept the women it had stopped pretending to call dancers. The whole of it, the store, the cribs, the camp's one-bought lawman, the very ground the diggers slept on, belonged by lease or by note or by plain fear to one man, and his name was Vernon Sloat. He was a heavy, soft man, going to fat, florid and clean-shaven, with oiled gray hair and a wine-colored vest and a watch chain across his belly thick enough to hang a dog with, and he had a way of being kind to your face that left you feeling robbed, and he owned Quartz Hollow the way frost owns a window, completely and from the inside, so that there was no part of your life in that camp his hand was not already laid across. Addie had kept her head down and her tub steaming for 2 years, and thought in the small cold way she let herself hope for anything, that invisibility would carry her through to a spring when she might have saved enough to get down off the mountain to a town with more than one street. She was wrong, and the thing that made her wrong came to her, as the worst things do, dressed as ordinary work. It was a dress, a good one, better than crib row women usually owned, dark green wool with jet buttons, brought to her tub by Sloat's own swamper, an old leering wreck of a man named Bram, who swept the Galena and missed nothing, with the curt word that it wanted washing and mending, quiet and quick. Addie knew the dress. It belonged to Lucy Dean, one of the dance hall women, younger even than Addie, with a baby a few months old, She kept in a basket in her crib and a laugh that was the only honest sound in that whole loud building. Addie had washed Lucy's things before and slipped her clean rags for the baby, and the two of them had built the small, wordless friendship women build at the bottom of a place like that, made mostly of one carrying the other's load a little way without being asked. And now here was Lucy's good green dress, and Lucy nowhere. And when Addie shook it out over the tub, the stiff, dark stain across the bodice and down the left side came apart in the hot water into a brown cloud that anybody who has ever cleaned a killing floor knows on sight. And her hands went still. Blood washes out of wool if you catch it soon enough and cold. But they had let this go and brought it to her warm, and that told its own story. And Addie stood there in the steam with her raw red hands in the pink water and understood three things at once, the way you understand a drop in the floor before your foot has finished falling. That Lucy Dean had not run off, the way Sloat had been telling the camp, that whatever had been done to her had been done close and bloody and not long ago, and with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, that she had been handed this dress to wash precisely because she was nobody, the invisible girl whose hands made evidence disappear for $1 a week, and whose word would weigh nothing against the man who owned the camp. She should have washed it and said nothing. The rabbit stillness 2 hard years had taught her screamed to forget it and keep her head down until spring. But before she could make herself do it, her fingers, going over the hem the way a mender's do, found the small hard lump sewn into it, a folded scrap of paper Lucy had stitched where no man searching a woman ever thinks to look. And Addie's hands, which had been so still, began without her permission to pick the stitches out. If you've ever found yourself holding a thing you cannot unhold, a truth that the moment it's in your hands has already changed what kind of person you'll have to be from here on out, then you already know exactly where Addie Vance was standing in the steam behind that saloon, and you know it is a colder place than any mountain. Stay up here with me a while, because that is the country this whole channel was built to walk, the steep frozen distance between keeping your head down to stay alive and lifting it to stay a person, and how the hardest souls on God's earth sometimes find each other in the exact place the world meant them to disappear. Subscribe and keep the notifications on, because the lamp's always burning up here at Timberline Hearts, and there's another soul climbing out of the cold every week. She did not read the note all the way through. Not then. She got 2 lines into Lucy Dean's small cramped hand, and her own breath stopped. And she heard Bram's broom go quiet on the other side of the wall, and some animal sense made her fold the paper back along its creases and push it deep into her apron pocket and plunge her hands back into the water as the swamper's face appeared around the door to see was she done. She was not done. She told him the stain wanted a second soaking, and he looked at her too long with his wet red eyes, and she kept her face the blank tired mask of a girl who washed things and thought nothing, and after a moment he grunted and went. And Addie Vance, alone again with the steam and the pink water and a dead girl's words folded against her hip, stood very still and felt the whole shape of the trap she was standing in, and knew that whatever she did next, the safe years of being invisible were over. Because you cannot unknow that a man has murdered a girl you liked, and you cannot unfeel the weight of her baby's whole future, and there are some loads a person discovers she would rather die under than set down. What she did next was small, and it was the bravest thing she had ever done. She did not run to the camp's one lawman, because the camp's one lawman was a bought ferret of a deputy named Pruitt, who drank on Sloat's tab and would have walked her straight back to the Galena by the collar. She did not run at all, not yet, because it was 40 miles of mountain to the next town, and the first snows were already gray on the high peaks. What she did was go, after dark, to Lucy Dean's crib and find it exactly as she'd feared. The bed stripped, the small things gone, scrubbed too clean, And the baby. The baby's still there, because a baby is a great deal harder to make disappear than a girl, and Sloat had not yet decided what to do with the inconvenient living evidence of the woman he'd killed. The infant was hungry and fouled and silent in the way babies go silent when crying has stopped bringing anyone, and Addie Vance, who had nothing in the world and no business taking on a thing she could not feed, picked him up out of that cold crib and held him against her, and felt his small mouth turn at once toward her neck. And that was that. She carried him back to her lean to under her shawl, and she fed him sugar water off her finger through the night, and she lay awake with him on her chest and Lucy's note in her fist, and understood that she was now carrying the two halves of the same unbearable thing, the proof of what had been done, and the small living reason it could never be allowed to stay buried. It took Sloat 3 days to find out, because nothing stays secret in a camp where the walls are plank and the swamper has wet red eyes, and there was only one soul soft enough and fool enough to have taken the child. On the 4th evening, with the sky to the northwest, gone the flat, bruised yellow-gray that mountain men learned to read as a death sentence, 2 of Sloat's men came to the wash house and told Addie that Mr. Sloat would see her, now up at the Galena, and bring the baby. She knew better than to refuse the man who owned the camp, and knew, too, that refusing only meant being carried. So she wrapped the baby warm and put Lucy's note where she always kept it now, folded small against her own skin, and went up the dark street into the warm, loud light of the Galena with her chin up and her stomach full of ice. The big room went quieter as she came in, the way a room does when everyone in it already knows what's coming, and is ashamed to watch and going to watch anyway. Sloat was at the bar, in his black coat and wine vest, a glass in his soft hand, and he turned to her with the warm, robbing smile and said, "For the room, Addie, you've done me a kindness, taking in poor Lucy's little one while she's away. But a wash girl can't raise a baby on $1 a week, now can she?" And the trap she had felt the shape of for 4 days began at last to close its jaws. He laid it out gently in front of the whole room, because a thing done in front of a crowd wears the costume of a thing done fair. Lucy Dean had run off, he said, and left her debts and her baby, and somebody had to answer for both. And wasn't it lucky that Addie was young and strong and without people of her own? There was a better paid place for her than the washtub, a place at the Galena where a pretty girl could clear her keep and the child's in a single good season. And here his voice never changed from its warm, reasonable register. And that was the obscene part, that he could offer to sell a grieving girl into the cribs in the same tone a man uses to offer a chair. "You'll find I'm generous," he said. "Or," and he let the words sit, "you can take the brat and your fine principles and find out how generous the company is to a vagrant who won't work. Your bunk's company property. So's that wash house. So's this whole mountain near enough." He sipped his glass. "I'd think hard, girl. It's a cold night coming, and a long way down." And Adeline Vance, standing in the warm, robbing light with a murdered woman's baby asleep against her and a murdered woman's words folded against her heart, did the thing that would nearly kill her, and would also, though she could not know it, save her life. She said no. She did not make a speech. She had learned long ago that speeches were for people the world was prepared to listen to. She just said, low and clear into the hush, "I know what you are. I know what happened to Lucy. I won't take her place, and I won't take your money, and I will not hand you this baby." For one heartbeat, the warm smile fell clean off Vernon Sloat's face, and what was under it looked at her, and she saw that she had been right about every cold thing, and that he saw in the same instant that the invisible wash girl was now the single loose thread that could unravel him. He could not shoot her in front of his own room. He was too careful a man for that, a man who did all his killing at a slant. So he did the slant thing, the lawful-looking thing that would let the camp tell itself no crime had been done. He nodded to his men, and they took her by the arms, and Sloat walked ahead of them and threw the door open on the screaming white dark, where the blizzard had finally come down off the divide in earnest, and said, almost kindly for the benefit of the room, "Nobody's putting a hand on her. She's free to go. She just can't stay." And they put her out into it, the baby and all, and shut the door. And through the plank wall she heard the warmth and the lamplight, and a man saying, "Let the mountain settle it then, and the bolt go home." The cold took her fast, the way it takes the small and the wet and the worn down first. She got perhaps 200 yards. She went up the street with her head down, past the dark wash house that was no longer hers, telling herself she could make the freight road and follow it down. And the moment she stepped past the last windbreak, the storm hit her full, and she understood she had told herself a child's lie. There was no road. There was no down. There was a white roar with no top and no bottom to it, snow driven so hard it was less falling than flying. And within 50 steps her thin wet wool had frozen to a shell, and she could not feel her hands at all, only knew by looking that her arms were still curled around the baby, who had gone silent. She fell, and got up, and fell, because the refusal to quit was the one thing the world had never managed to wash out of her. And then it became only falling, and she was on her knees in a drift to her waist, and the killing warmth came over her like a quilt, the lie of it so gentle, and she bent the whole way over the child to give him the last heat in her body, and she thought, with the strange flat clarity of the freezing, that her mother had drowned, and now she would freeze, and that the only thing she owned in all the world was a smooth gray stone with a hole worn through it, tied at her wrist, that her mother had pressed into her hand the spring before the river took her, and called lucky. It had not been lucky. She turned it once with a thumb she could not feel, an old habit older than memory, and shut her eyes against the warm white dark. That was when the storm split open and the shape came through it. She did not see him so much as feel the wind change, a great darkness breaking the wind off her, and a smell that was not snow, wet hide and pine pitch and cold iron, and then a grip on her shoulder hard enough to hurt, hurt being the proof she was still alive to be hurt. A voice came down through the roar, low and scraped and absolutely without panic, a voice that had decided the situation and was now only managing it. "You're not done yet," it said. And then, when she could not answer, a gloved hand worked at the frozen thread at her wrist and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of it, under the little stone, feeling for the pulse beneath, and found it, faint and far off, but there, and the voice said, half to itself, "There it is," as though her heartbeat were a track he had been cutting for and finally found in the snow. He did not waste words asking who she was or how she came to be dying on his mountain. He saw the frozen bundle she would not unclamp her arms from, and understood it, and made a sound that was almost anger. And then the world tilted, and she was up out of the drift, and against the furnace of him, the baby pinned warm between, and he turned his back to the wind and began to climb. She remembered the climb only in pieces, because the body coming warm again hurts worse than the freezing, and the mind hides from it. She remembered the swing of his stride in snowshoes, the wall of his shoulders breaking the wind, the heat coming off him through the hide coat like a stove through a door, and his voice every little while, not gentle, only steady, telling her she would keep breathing, and the child was breathing, in the flat way of a man who would have said the same if it were 10 miles. She remembered the wind dropping all at once as they came in under timber, a darker shape against a black cliff that turned out to be a building, and the smell that came out the low door, wood smoke and tallow and cured hide, the smell of the inside of a living thing, And then warmth, a banked stove breathing in the dark, the baby lifted out of her dead arms by two enormous careful hands. A long pause, and then the best sound she had heard in 4 days. A thin, furious wail as the child came back to himself in the heat. She was crying, and could not feel that she was. "He's mad," the man said from somewhere above her. "Mad's good. Mad means he's got the strength to be mad." And those were the first kind words anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember. And they were not even meant to be kind, and she went down into the dark holding on to them. If you've made it this far into Addie's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She woke not knowing how long she had been under, in a dim, close room gone gold at one end where a stove burned, wrapped in blankets that smelled of pine and smoke and another person, with a deep all-over ache that meant she had not, against every odd, lost any part of herself to the frost. The baby was alive. That was the first thing she made sure of, and there he was. Swaddled in a clean flour sack and tucked in a hide-padded crate close to the stove, sleeping the boneless sleep of the fed and the safe. Someone had fed him. A tin cup held the dried trace of warmed goat's milk, and Addie Vance sat in a stranger's bed with her ruined hands shaking, and understood that while she lay senseless, a man she had never seen in daylight had kept a murdered woman's baby alive through the night, and the old reflex came up hard and fast, the reflex of a girl who had learned that nothing is free, and every kindness is the first half of a bill. And she looked for the man to find out what she had been saved for and when the door would open on different terms. The door opened. He came in stamping snow off his boots with an armload of split wood, a mountain of a man in the gray light, long dark hair to his collar, a heavy dark beard, a scar down one side of his jaw and a notch out of one eyebrow, and the thing she braced for did not come. He nodded at the baby. He took milk twice in the night and once at dawn. "Goat's out back. There's enough." He hung his coat. "You lost no fingers. Toes neither. You'll hurt a few days. That's the thawing, not the freezing. It passes." And that was all. He filled a second tin cup and set it on the table near her, not handing it over, just setting it where a half-frozen person could reach it without having to ask, and said, "Drink that. Name's Caleb. If you need something to call me." She told him hers, and the baby's, which she had decided in the night would be Wren, because Lucy had called the boy her little bird and Addie could not bear to leave him nameless. He nodded once, as if filing the words where they belonged, and that was the whole of their first conversation. The cabin was one room built against a cliff, fitted logs gone silver with weather, a stone chimney, one shuttered window, a low door he had to duck under, a rope bed, a plank table, 2 rounds of log for chairs, a shelf of tins, a hanging slab of bacon, strings of dried apple, a lean-to off the back where she could hear a goat complain and a horse shift its feet. And on the wall, in a grated oiled row, his traps, each in its place, and over the door on 2 pegs a lever-action Winchester, cleaned and waiting. And Addie understood from the bone-deep order of the place the same thing she would later understand about the man, that this was someone who kept his dangerous things exactly where his hand could find them in the black dark. He did not, that first day, ask her a single question about how a woman and an infant came to be freezing below his timberline in the first storm of the year. She kept waiting for it, the question that would be the lever, and it did not come. And only much later did she understand that he had read the whole story already off the thin, wet town clothes, and the cracked hands, and the way she flinched from a raised arm. And that a man who has decided to ask nothing of you is a thing so far outside what the world had taught her that she had no shelf to set it on. What he did when the early dark came down was take a bedroll and a wolf robe off the wall and carry them toward the lean to out to bed down with the animals in the cold, and over his shoulder, flat as a man reporting the weather, he said the thing that began, against every wall she had, to undo her. "I won't touch you, nor the boy. Door bars from the inside, there's the bar. Throw it if it sits easier." And he went out and pulled the door to behind him and left a half-frozen stranger and a dead woman's child alone in a warm room with food they had not paid for and a heavy oak bar they were welcome to drop against him. Addie did not sleep at first. She watched the door and waited for the catch, the price, the moment the bar would be tested from the other side. It did not come. And after a long while, when the heat had got far enough into her bones that her pride could no longer hold it off, she ate the broth he'd left, and she dropped the bar across the door, not against him, she told herself, but because dropping it was a thing she could do. One small coin of control on a day that had spent everything else she owned, and she lay down with the baby's heartbeat against her chest and her mother's stone cold at her wrist, and the last thing she thought before the dark took her was that this man frightened her worse than Vernon Sloat ever had, because Sloat she had known the whole shape of in a single look, and this one she could not get the measure of. And the things you cannot measure are the ones that cost you everything. She learned the shape of his silence over the days that followed, and learned that it was not empty, but full, the way old timber is full. He rose before light and ran a trapline that took him hours up the frozen drainages, and she would stand in the door with the baby and watch his dark, patient shape come back at dusk, with the day's catch frozen stiff over his shoulder. He skinned and fleshed and stretched in the cold blue evenings, hands sure and somehow gentle on the dead animals, and the cabin filled with the green smell of hides and rendered tallow. He spoke to her almost only in instruction. The spring out back, not the creek, for water. Wood from the left rick burns hot for cooking. If anything comes into the yard on 2 legs or 4, you take the boy and get behind the bar and do not come out. Not for any voice, not even mine. Never a word that could be mistaken for tenderness, and under every flat instruction the same buried thing, "Here is how you stay alive." It should have comforted her. Instead, it made her wild, and she could not have explained the wildness to a living soul. His refusal to name a price, his refusal even to be thanked, was itself a kind of debt that grew by the day, compounding like a store account. And she had no way under heaven to discharge it, and a debt you cannot pay is a hand at the throat to a person built the way Addie Vance was built. On the 4th morning she could not stand it. She rose before he did and built the fire and had the place swept and the baby fed by the time he came in stamping cold off his boots. And she stood up straight with her chin high and said, hard, the way she had rehearsed it in the dark, "We'll earn our keep, the boy and I. I'm not a beggar and I won't be kept like one. Tell me what work pays for what you did, all of it, and I'll do it every hour till it's square." She had meant it to sound like strength. It came out closer to pleading, and they both heard it. Caleb Mercer looked at her a long moment, and the scar caught the firelight along his jaw, and what he said was so quiet she nearly lost it under the stove. "Stop trying to pay me back." He set down the brace of marten he carried. "There's no bill. I didn't pull you out of that snow to put you in a different kind of debt. You start keeping a ledger on a thing like staying alive, it never comes square. And you'll spend whatever time you've got left cold on the inside trying to make it. I watched that happen to somebody once. So don't." It was the most words she had yet had from him, and the nearest to anger she would ever see him come, which, in him, meant only that his voice dropped lower and his hands went still. "If you want to work, because the work needs doing, and there's 3 mouths now where there was 1, then work, and welcome to it. But not to pay me. That I won't take off you." It should have freed her, and instead it cracked something open. Because Adeline Vance had spent her whole life believing that affection was a transaction and kindness a loan against future payment, that her own worth was the exact sum of what her hands could provide and not one penny more. And here was a scarred, half-wild stranger telling her that the largest thing anyone had ever done for her could not be bought back, was simply hers, free, a thing she would have to learn to carry instead of repay. She turned to the stove so he would not see her face. "Then I'll work because it needs doing," she said to the iron. And she did. What her hands could not do at first, she learned, one ruined thing at a time. Her laundress's hands were already hard in their own way, red and lye cracked from 2 years of wringing wool. But the work up here found new places to break her. She burned her palm on the rendering kettle. She laid her thumb open to the bone, learning the skinning knife. She raised blisters that broke and wept on the maul handle until she could not close her fingers at night. Caleb did not coddle her and did not mock her. When she cut herself, he washed it with spirit that made her hiss and bound it and said only, "Blade works toward the bone, not toward your hand. Turn it." When the maul glanced off a frozen round and nearly took her shin, he stood the round on a higher block and showed her, once, the swing that lets the weight of the iron do the work the shoulder cannot, and then went back to his own labor and let her fail at it until she didn't. On the 8th day, she split a whole rick of stovewood without weeping. By the end of the 2nd week, the soft places on her palms had gone to callous over the old lye cracks, and she caught herself one evening turning her own hard hands over in the firelight with a fierce, ugly pride she had no word for. And across the cabin she felt him notice it, and neither of them said a thing. The baby tied the days together and nearly came apart in her hands more than once, because an infant on a mountain in winter is a candle in a draught, and Addie, who had never raised a child, had to learn that too, with Caleb's flat help and the scrawny dun goat that had taken against everyone in the world except, for reasons known only to goats, the baby. Caleb showed her how to warm the goat's milk to blood heat, and no hotter against the inside of her own wrist, the wrist where the stone hung, and how to read the difference between a baby crying hungry and a baby crying because something was wrong, which is a language no one is born knowing. Wren grew, the daily miracle she did not let herself look at straight for fear of jinxing it. He filled out his swaddling, found his fist and then his foot, learned to fix his pale eyes on the dark bulk of Caleb across the room and follow him, and once, in the 3rd week, he laughed. A sudden gummy shriek of delight at the goat's ear, and Caleb Mercer froze with a hide half off the board, and a look came over the scarred ruin of his face that Addie would think about for a long time after. A look like a man hearing a sound he had buried so deep he'd forgotten a house could make it. She learned the iron economy of the place the way she learned everything, by getting it wrong and being let to. A marten rubbed raw against the brush was worth nothing. A marten handled clean was worth a week of coffee and salt down at the Valley Trading Post. The cold came up through the floorboards a full hour before it ever came under the door, and you set a trap so it took the animal quick instead of slow, because Caleb would not abide a slow death even in the creatures he killed to live. And that single fact told her more about the man than any confession could have. On the 14th morning, he handed her the skinning knife without a word and stepped back, and she understood it for the test it was, and she made the first cut too deep and ruined a strip of fur worth real money, and waited for him to take the knife back. He did not. Again, he said, and turned a second carcass toward her, and let her ruin that one too, and a third less so. And by the 4th, her hands had found the clean peeling pull that lifts the hide off the meat in one piece, and she looked up, and he had already gone back to his own work, which was the only praise the man knew how to give, and the truest she had ever been given. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the shrinking stack of stove wood and the growing stack of cured pelts, and the snow line creeping lower down the peaks each gray dawn. The pass above the cabin filled and closed, the lower trail to the camp drifted over, the world narrowed to one warm room and a cliff and a stretch of white meadow. And somewhere in the ordinary brutal arithmetic of staying alive beside him, Addie Vance stopped flinching when he came through the door, and Caleb Mercer stopped carrying his rifle out to the lean-to at night, and two people who had each long ago decided they would do their dying alone began, without once saying so, to do their living next to someone else. She still kept the sharpened laundry paddle by the bed the first weeks, and then one morning noticed she had not thought of it in days, and did not put it back. The fever came for the baby in the deep middle of winter, on the worst possible night, the way these things always come. It started small, a fretfulness, a warmth to his skin that she told herself was only the stove, and by the second evening Wren was burning hot to the touch and pulling at the air with a thin wet rattle in his small chest that turned Addie's blood to ice water because she had heard that exact sound before, the winter the fever came up the creek, in grown men who did not live to the thaw. The helplessness of it rose up in her now and tried to drown her. Caleb came in from the dark and listened to the baby breathe for 3 breaths and did not waste a second telling her it would be all right. Croup, or the lung fever coming, he said. Either way, it's the airway. We keep his chest loose and his throat open and keep him breathing till his own body wins it. Build the fire up. Don't count the wood tonight. And then the silent trapper who spoke in flat instructions became, for one long night, a man who knew exactly what to do with his hands, and Addie understood that she was watching him fight a thing he had fought before and lost. They made a tent of a blanket draped over 2 chairs in the wood crate, and into it Caleb set a kettle, kept just off the boil, and into the water he crushed handfuls of the dark twisted herb from the shelf, eucalyptus traded up from a packer who got it off a ship, and pine pitch in a green wad of yarrow, until the little tent filled with a sharp medicinal steam that pried the airway open. And Addie sat in that hot, wet dark with the baby upright against her collarbone so the steam could reach him, hour after hour, while Caleb brewed a bitter willow bark tea and got it into him a drop at a time off the corner of a rag to bring the burning down. When the fever spiked past what the steam could hold, they did the other thing the old trappers swore by, stripped the hot, dry baby and wrapped him in a cloth wrung out in snow melt, just cool enough to pull the heat without shocking him. And Addie wept because he screamed at the cold, and Caleb said, "Lo, the scream's good. Screaming. He's breathing. It's the quiet you fight." And she understood that the man had a whole grammar of survival built around the difference between the cries that mean life and the silence that means you are losing. It was in the blackest stretch of that night, somewhere past the turn when the world is at its lowest ebb and a sick child seems to weigh nothing at all, that the silence between them finally cracked open, and the man began, at last, to talk. He had a wife once, he told the dark, not looking at her, his big hands steady on the kettle. In Ohio, before the war, he had married her at 19 and gone for a soldier at 21 because the money was good and they were poor, and he had been away at the front the winter the fever came through the river counties, and by the time a letter found him in Tennessee, the wife and the child she had been carrying were already in the ground, both of them. The baby never named. He had come home in the spring to 2 graves the neighbors had dug, because the ground had been frozen too hard that winter for more than a shallow scrape, and he had spent his first week back thawing that ground with a fire, foot by foot, to bury his own people deep enough that the wolves would let them rest. "I learned to kill men for a wage that year," he said, "and while I was getting good at it, the only 2 people I had froze into the dirt with nobody but the trees to hear them go. So I came up here where it asks nothing of you and gives nothing back, and told myself that was peace." He turned the willow bark rag in his fingers. "The worst part of living up here isn't the cold, Addie. It's that when the thing finally comes for you, and you scream, the only thing in all the world that hears you is the trees." And then, with the baby's breath at last beginning to ease against her collarbone and the gray of dawn just starting at the shutter cracks, Caleb Mercer detonated the engine of the whole long winter, quietly, the way he did everything. "I want you to hear this once, clear, so you stop carrying it," he said. "Pulling you out of that snow bought me nothing. There's no debt, there never was, and the day that pass clears in the spring, you and the boy are free to walk down it and go anywhere you want. And you won't owe me a grain for any of it. I didn't do it to keep you. I did it because I stood at the bottom of a mountain once and let the cold take everything I had, and I will not stand on top of one and watch it take somebody else's while I've got two hands to stop it." He finally looked at her across the dim. "That's the whole of it. You're not bought, and you're not kept, and you're free." And Adeline Vance sat in the steam-wet dark with a breathing baby against her heart and her dead mother's stone at her wrist, and understood that the thing she had been frantic for half a winter to repay had never existed, that there had never been a debt at all. Only two ruined people each braced for the other to finally name the price, and that the thing growing in that one warm room was the single kind she had never once been offered. The kind with no bill at the end of it, and it frightened her more than the fever, more than Sloat, more than the cold, because a debt she knew how to live under, and this she did not. The baby lived. By the second morning the rattle had loosened and broken up, and Wren was taking milk again and glaring at the world with the personal outrage of the recovering, and Caleb slept the night through for the first time since the fever broke, and Addie watched the two of them. The great scarred man and the small furious child, breathing in the same warm room, and felt the last of her armor go quietly to pieces, not with a crash but the way river ice goes in the spring, from underneath, all at once and without a sound. She had no words for it that did not sound like a debt, and so instead, 2 nights later, she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to finally trust him with the truth she had carried sewn against her skin since the night she was cast out. She took out Lucy Dean's note. She had not read it through, not once. Not in the storm, and not in all the weeks after. She had been too afraid. As though reading the dead girl's last words all the way to the end would make them final. Now she unfolded the small creased paper by the stove with Caleb sitting still across from her, and read it aloud, and Lucy Dean's voice came up off the cheap paper as clear as if she sat among them. It was not long. A woman at the bottom of the world does not get many words, and Lucy had spent hers carefully. She wrote that if anyone was reading this then, Sloat had done what he'd been threatening, and she wanted it written down somewhere that it was him. She had seen something she was not meant to see, a back room at the Galena and a man dead on the floor over a cheated claim, a man Sloat had killed with his own hands and meant to bury quiet, and Sloat had known she'd seen, and from that night, she had lived on borrowed time. She named the dead man. She named the date. She wrote that she had a son named Wren, and begged whoever found this to see him safe and tell him, someday, that his mother had not run off and left him, that she had been killed for knowing the truth, and that she had loved him with everything a girl in her place had left to love with. And the last line, in a hand gone shaky, was this: "I am not nobody. Write it down so I am not nobody." Addie Vance lowered the paper into her lap, and the cabin was very quiet, and Caleb Mercer sat with his jaw set hard and his pale eyes wet in the firelight, and after a while he said, "Lo, that paper hangs him. A date, a name, a witness who wrote it down before she died, against a man who told the whole camp she ran off. He looked at her. "And you carried it down a mountain in a blizzard with a baby, and you'd have died in that drift before you let it go." He shook his head slowly, and the thing in his voice was not pity, but something nearer to awe. "I've known hard men my whole life. I never once met anybody as hard to kill as a woman protecting something that isn't even hers." And Addie understood, holding the note, that the thing she had taken for her own stubbornness, the thing the world had called foolishness and her own fear had called weakness, had a different name up here, and the name was courage, and Caleb had been calling it that all winter in the only language he had, which was to hand her a knife and a rifle and a child's whole life and trust her not to drop any of them. But debts have a way of opening back up, and the worst ones do not stay buried under any snow. Vernon Sloat had told his camp that the wash girl took herself off into the storm of her own fool will, and for a few weeks that lie had held, because a camp wants to believe its own comfortable story. What broke it was the swamper. Old Bram, drunk and maudlin in a corner of the Galena, let it slip to a packer that the trapper Mercer had 2 new mouths up at his cabin since the first blizzard, a woman and a babe. And within the day it had climbed the rotten little ladder of camp gossip to Sloat, who went still and cold behind his warm, robbing smile, because he understood at once what nobody else had worked out, that the wash girl had not died, that she was 4,000 feet up a mountain with the one piece of paper that could put a rope around his neck, and that the spring thaw, which would open the pass, would also open a road down to a territorial marshal who did not drink on Sloat's tab. He did not wait for spring. That was his mistake. The impatience of a frightened, guilty man. But it was very nearly all of their deaths first. In the last hard weeks of winter, in a false thaw that crusted the snow just firm enough to bear a horse, Vernon Sloat came up the mountain to settle his account the way such men always do, behind a coat of paper and a borrowed star and the courage of numbers. He brought Deputy Pruitt, ferret-faced and bottle-brave, with a tin star and a vagrancy warrant sworn out lawful and proper for one Adeline Vance, who had absconded from her employment and her debts and was to be retaken and returned. And behind the deputy, 4 hard men in heavy dusters with lever-action rifles across their saddle bows, paid in coin to bring a woman and a baby down off a mountain and not to ask why, and if they did not come quiet, well, the mountain was a dangerous place in winter, and a warrant is a wonderful thing for making a killing look like the law. Caleb saw them coming. He had cut their sign that morning on the lower trail, 6 horses where no horse should be, and he came back to the cabin moving fast and quiet and told her the shape of it in 4 flat sentences, and Addie Vance felt the old wash-house terror rise up in her, and then felt it meet something new the winter had built in her without her noticing, and the new thing won. She did not freeze. "How long?" she said. "An hour, maybe less," he said, already taking the Winchester down off the pegs. "They'll come up the open meadow because there's no other way to bring horses. Pruitt will read his paper first to make it lawful, and then if we don't fold, they'll do it the other way." He looked at her. "Addie, I can put you and the boy out the back and up into the rocks where they'll never find you, and hold the door alone. That's the smart play, and I'll do it if you say." And Adeline Vance looked at the man who had pulled her out of the snow and refused to own her, and at the baby in the wood crate, and she heard Lucy Dean's voice as clear as the stove. "I'm not nobody. No," she said. "I have spent my whole life behind a door with my head down, waiting for the men who own everything to decide what I'm worth. Not this time. You're not holding that door alone." And he looked at her one long moment, and then did the thing that told her everything they had become across one hard winter. He did not argue, and he did not send her to the rocks. He took the old single shot from under the bunk and a box of cartridges and set it on the table beside the Winchester. "Then we'd best be quick. You've handled the rifle at the woodpile all month and didn't know I was teaching you. Now I'm telling you. Here's the rest of it. And in the little time they had he taught her the last of it. The breathing and the slow squeeze and the way you do not fight the kick, but let it come through you, and to make every shot a true one because they had powder for a fight, but not for a careless one. She set the baby deep in the wood crate and pushed it into the corner behind the cold iron of the stove where no stray ball could find him. And she pressed her mother's stone to her lips once, the smooth, worn hole of it, and she took up her place at the shuttered window with the loophole. And she noticed it with a kind of wonder even then. In the worst hour of her life, her hands were not shaking anymore. They came up the meadow just as Caleb had said, 6 riders strung out across the snow in the hard flat light, and stopped out of easy range, and Deputy Pruitt stood in his stirrups and read the warrant out across the white in a thin official whine, every word of it lawful, and every word of it a lie, ordering the woman Adeline Vance to come out and submit, and the man Mercer to give her up, or stand in violation of the law. And Caleb Mercer opened the cabin door and stood in it, filling it, the rifle held loose and ready, and let the deputy finish, and then said, in a voice that did not need raising and carried across that meadow like a dropped axe, "There's no vagrant here. There's a witness to a murder, and the murderer's sitting his horse 40 feet from me trying to make it sound like paperwork. You all rode up here to help a man kill a girl to keep her quiet. Sit with that a minute before anybody gets down off his horse." And he let it sit, and Addie watched from the loophole as the 4 hired men, who had been told they were collecting a runaway, traded a look among themselves, because there's a great deal of difference in a hired man's mind between hauling back a vagrant and murdering a witness, and Caleb had just moved the whole business from the first into the second in front of their eyes. It was Vernon Sloat who could not let it sit, because guilty men cannot bear silence, and he pushed his horse forward a length and dropped all the warmth out of his voice at last. "She's a thief and a liar, and she's got something of mine," he said, "and any man too soft for the work can ride down now and forfeit his pay." He jerked his chin at the cabin. "Take them," and for one held breath the meadow hung on the edge of slaughter. And then Adeline Vance did the thing that ended it, and she did it not with the rifle but with her voice, because she had finally learned, up on that mountain, that her word was not worth nothing after all. She called out from the window, clear and carrying across the snow, "Lucy Dean wrote it down before you killed her, Sloat. The man you murdered in the back room at the Galena, over the silver, the date, your name, all of it, in her own hand, and it's not in this cabin. It's already gone down to people who'll carry it to the marshal, whatever happens to us here." It was a lie. The note was sewn against her heart not 40 feet from him. And it was the best lie she ever told, because she watched it land on him like a ball, watched his face go gray as he understood that killing them would not close his account but open it, that he had ridden up a mountain to silence a thing that could no longer be silenced. And the 4 hired men heard it too, heard a name and a date, and the word murder turned from camp gossip into a dead woman's sworn hand, and one of them said, "Flat, I didn't sign on for a hanging matter," and turned his horse, and then another, and the courage of numbers, the only courage Vernon Sloat had ever been able to buy, came apart in the cold like everything else that winter. Deputy Pruitt, left suddenly with 2 riders gone and a warrant turned to ash in his hand, made the last bad choice of the day. He panicked and clawed for the pistol at his belt to do by force what the paper no longer could. And Caleb Mercer, who had been still as the cliff behind him through all of it, moved at last, and Addie understood in that instant the thing the camp had only whispered. About the silent trapper, the cold mechanical speed of a man who had done this before and felt nothing doing it. The Winchester came up and spoke once, and the deputy's pistol spun away into the snow, and Pruitt was clutching a shattered hand and screaming, breathing, alive, because Caleb even now would not abide a needless death, and before the echo had finished off the cliff, he had levered the next round and put it on Sloat and come down off the cabin step toward the man on the horse, unhurried, closing the distance, and that was the thing that broke Sloat entirely. The coward in him, the one that had always done its killing at a slant, behind paper and through hired hands, looked at the scarred mountain of a man walking toward him with a rifle and no fear in him at all, and Vernon Sloat hauled his horse around and ran. The great owner of Quartz Hollow, running flat out down his own mountain alone, his deputy bleeding in the snow and his hired men scattering. Nothing left of his empire but the cold knowledge that somewhere below him a dead girl's words were loose and coming for him. They did not have to chase him, and that was the mercy and the justice of it both. Caleb sent word down with the 2 hired men who'd quit, only too glad now to be witnesses on the right side of a hanging matter. And when the pass opened, Addie sent Lucy Dean's note 40 miles on to the territorial marshal at the county seat, the one who took no man's tab, along with the sworn word of the 2 regulators and the swamper Bram, who came forward at the last shamed and weeping to say he'd carried the green dress to the wash girl on Sloat's order and had hated his own face ever since. And the truth, once loose, moved the way truth moves when enough frightened people decide at the same moment to stop being afraid. Vernon Sloat was taken at a stage stop trying to buy passage south under another name, and a dead girl who had begged with her last words only to be written down so she would not be nobody was, in the end, written down in a courtroom in front of the territory, her name read out, and her son's name with it. And the man who had thrown a witness into a blizzard to let the mountain do his murdering was hanged by a law he could not buy. For a murder a wash girl would not let stay buried. But the courtroom was 40 miles and a season away, and the truest hour came earlier, on the mountain, the morning after the meadow, when the danger had drained out of the world and left it washed and blinding and still. The 3 of them were alive. All 3, in the warm cabin against the cliff. Addie stood in the open door with the baby on her hip in the dazzle, and Caleb came and stood beside her close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. And after a while she said the thing she had been unable to say in words for weeks, and she said it the only way she knew, in his language plainly, looking out at the snow and not at him. When the pass opens, she said, I'm not going down it. She turned the stone once at her wrist. You told me I was free to go anywhere in the world. This is where I want to go. And Caleb Mercer was quiet a long moment. And then the man who had refused for one whole winter to make a sound that could be mistaken for tenderness reached over, slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and closed his big scarred hand around hers where it worried the little stone, and held it. And that was the whole of his answer, and it was enough. And they watched the sun come up white and clean over the Bitterroot Peaks, with a dead girl's son warm between them. They did not marry that spring, though they would, plainly and quietly in time, in the valley town on the far side of the divide, with Bram come down out of the hills for it, and the 2 reformed regulators standing up as witnesses. But the marrying was never the point, and Addie would have told you so. The point was the morning in the door, and the choosing, and the slow turning of 2 people who had each decided to die alone toward the difficult miracle of living on purpose next to someone else. They raised Wren in the cabin against the cliff, and then in a clean cabin lower down with a creek that ran clear, and they told him the truth of his mother when he was old enough to carry it. That Lucy Dean had not run off and left him, but had died protecting the truth, and had begged with her last breath that he be kept safe and told she loved him, and that a wash girl with nothing in the world had carried him down a mountain in a blizzard rather than let him freeze. And on a nail by the door of that home, where another house might have hung a horseshoe, there hung a small gray river stone worn smooth with a hole through it, And on the evenings when the light went long and gold over the peaks and Caleb was laid in off the high line, Adeline Mercer would step out onto the porch and turn the stone once with her thumb. The old habit, no longer a thing to hold against drowning, but only a thing to hold. And watch the tree line for the big scarred shape of him coming home, a woman who had stopped somewhere across one hard winter, waiting for the trap to close. The cold is the cleanest weapon a cruel man has, because it does its work in the dark and leaves no mark on his hands, and Vernon Sloat spent his whole life learning to kill that way, at a slant, behind paper and weather and hired men, certain that a girl with no people and no money was a thing the world would let quietly disappear. And it nearly did. She was 200 yards and one more fall from being exactly the nobody he needed her to be. What he did not count on is that the same cold he meant to use as a weapon is also the thing that strips two ruined people down to what they are truly made of. And that's sometimes what they are made of, underneath the fear and the years of keeping their heads down, is the kind of stubborn, unkillable love that walks into a blizzard for a stranger's child and stands in a doorway with a rifle and will not let the dark have one more person it has no right to. So here is what I'll leave you with, and I'd honestly like to know, because I read every last one of these. Addie Vance believed for most of her life that the only safe way to live was to be nobody, to keep her head down and owe no one and be owed nothing, so no man would ever have a reason to come for her. And it took a murdered friend's last words and a silent man who refused to own her to teach her that being nobody is not safety. It is just a slower way of disappearing, and that the moment that saved her life was the moment she lifted her head and said, out loud, "This matters, and so do I." So tell me, honest, down in the comments, if a man had thrown you into that storm and the mountain offered you the easy, warm lie of lying down in the snow, do you think you'd have lain down, the way the world spends so many lives teaching us to? Or do you think you'd have got up and fallen and got up again and stood in a doorway with the Winchester? Tell me which one you think you've got in you. And so the lamp burns low in the high cabin while the snow keeps falling soft against the shutters. Stay warm, stay a while, and I'll see you up the pass next week.